I never thought it would come to this. The quiet resentment, the overwhelming loneliness, and the growing distance between us. Things I had never imagined could happen in my marriage with James. But here I am, recounting the first cracks that began to form all those months ago. The moments I now realize I should have recognized as the beginning of the end. James and I had been married for 6 years by the time I noticed the subtle but unmistakable signs that our marriage was unraveling. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that life was stressful, and that we both were simply tired. But as the months went by, I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. We no longer laughed together. I can't even remember the last time we made a plan for the future. No more spontaneous trips, no more inside jokes. When we sat across from each other at dinner, it felt like I was having a conversation with a colleague, not my husband. He was always buried in his work, staying late at the office, taking calls, constantly busy with something. I tried to talk to him about it, tried to reach out, but every time I did, I was met with excuses. "I'm swamped at work, Sarah," or "Can we talk about this later? I have a meeting." The days blurred into one another, and I was left waiting for something, anything, that would make me feel like we were still a couple. But nothing came. It was Megan who suggested therapy. Megan had always been the one who noticed the little things. She could tell when something was off, even when I tried to hide it. One night, after another tense dinner where James barely looked up from his phone, Megan pulled me aside. "Sarah, what's going on? You've been acting distant, and you look, I don't know, lost." I shrugged it off, of course, saying that I was just stressed with work. But she wasn't convinced. She insisted that I see someone, and after much hesitation, I agreed. I called a few therapists, and the one who had an opening was Dr. Julian Cross. I still remember walking into his office that first day, unsure of what I was hoping for. I had no idea that one simple decision would change everything. Dr. Cross was kind, professional, but not overly warm. He made me feel safe enough to talk, though. I remember the conversation like it was yesterday, how I described my feelings of neglect, how James was never there, how our communication had completely fallen apart. "I feel like I'm invisible to him," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what happened to us." Julian listened carefully, nodding at times, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he gently suggested that I try to open up more to James, to express my feelings more openly and directly. He said that perhaps James didn't realize the extent of my dissatisfaction, that maybe I needed to communicate my needs more clearly. I left the session feeling a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. Could it really be that simple? Could I really fix things by just talking to him? I threw myself into therapy. Julian was insightful, and the more I went, the more I found myself opening up to him about everything. About my dissatisfaction, my frustration, my confusion. And somehow, I felt heard in a way that I hadn't felt in years. Every session gave me new tools to communicate better with James, to try and mend the emotional distance between us. But as time went on, something began to shift. Julian wasn't just a therapist anymore. He became my confidant, my escape. I started looking forward to our sessions, not just because they gave me clarity about my marriage, but because I felt understood there in a way that I never felt at home. James never noticed, of course. He was still lost in his work, still distant. My efforts to talk to him grew more and more forced. He never seemed to care, or even try to understand what I was going through. But Julian was always there, listening, offering advice, offering a different perspective. And then, I started thinking about him more than I should have. I'd find myself reflecting on the way he spoke, the way he listened to me so intently, how he always seemed to have time for me, even when everything else in my life felt like it was falling apart. There was a part of me that knew I was crossing a line, but another part of me, the part that had been neglected for so long, was drawn to it, to him. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, I decided to confront James. I needed to know if he cared at all, if there was any chance that we could fix this. We were sitting in the living room, the soft hum of the TV in the background, and I turned to him, my heart pounding. "James, we need to talk. About us. About what's happening to our marriage." He didn't look up from his phone. "Not now, Sarah. I have a presentation tomorrow. and I can't deal with this right now. I felt the familiar sting of rejection, the same sting I had felt 1,000 times before. I tried again, my voice shaking with frustration. James, I can't keep pretending like everything is fine. You never listen to me. You're always too busy for me, and I feel like I'm fighting this battle alone. Do you even care? He looked up briefly, his face cold. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm doing this for us. I'm working hard to provide for us. What more do you want from me? I didn't know how to respond. His words were like a slap in the face. He thought providing financially was enough. He had no idea how empty I felt emotionally, how desperate I was for some kind of connection, some sign that he still cared. Megan wasn't blind. She saw the changes in me before anyone else. She noticed how I became more withdrawn, how I was no longer the upbeat, talkative Sarah she had known. I was quiet, irritable, and constantly tired. Sarah, something's wrong. I can see it, she said one afternoon as we sipped coffee at our favorite cafe. What's going on with you? Is it James? I tried to brush it off, saying that I was just stressed, that everything was fine. But Megan wasn't fooled. Come on, Sarah. I know you better than that. I can tell something's off. You've been spending more and more time with your therapist, and honestly, I think James is the last person you talk to about anything anymore. I looked down at my coffee cup, feeling a pang of guilt, but I wasn't ready to tell her everything. Not yet. I'm fine, Meg. Really, I lied, forcing a smile. But Megan wasn't convinced. She didn't push me, though. She respected my space, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I should have listened to her. That's how it started. The slow unraveling of everything I thought I knew about love, about marriage. If only I had known back then where it would all lead. But at the time, I was just trying to hold on, hoping that somehow, things would get better. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't plan for it. I didn't intend to cross that line. But somewhere between the countless therapy sessions, the long talks with Julian, and the slowly deepening emotional distance from James, something shifted. The boundaries blurred, and I found myself doing things I never thought I would. It started so innocently. I was desperate, confused, and emotionally starved. Julian had become more than just a therapist. I went to him seeking help with my marriage, and he gave me that, at first. But somewhere along the way, he became the one person who truly seemed to understand me, who listened without judgment. It was more than just professional therapy at that point. Our conversations went beyond marriage. We started talking about my childhood, my fears, my dreams, things I had never shared with anyone, especially not James. I felt safe with Julian. In those moments, he seemed to know me better than anyone else ever had. Each session began to feel like a bonding experience. Julian's words comforted me in a way that James's never had. James was distant, consumed by his work, always busy, while Julian was present, attentive, kind. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was intoxicating. One night, after a particularly intense session, I was crying. I felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. My marriage, my life, everything. Julian had been listening to me vent for over an hour, his eyes soft with understanding. I don't even know how it happened. I wasn't thinking clearly. I had never expected him to touch me, but then he did. He reached out, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, and pulled me into a hug. It was comforting, tender. And then, as I stood there, crying against his chest, I felt something shift between us. The embrace lingered a little longer than it should have. And then, he kissed me. It wasn't just a quick peck. It was a kiss that felt like a release, like all the tension, all the pain, was suddenly being poured into something tangible. I didn't stop him. I didn't pull away. I let myself melt into him, letting the emotional connection we had been building finally break free. Afterward, I stood there in shock, my mind racing. What had just happened? How had I allowed myself to cross that line? I convinced myself it was a one-time thing, that it was just an emotional moment that would fade. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Julian was no longer just my therapist. He was someone else entirely, someone I didn't want to let go of. And that kiss, that moment, was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to push away the guilt, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. And yet, the more I saw Julian, the more I wanted to see him. The guilt faded, replaced by an overwhelming desire for the emotional intimacy he offered. We began meeting outside of therapy, ostensibly to continue our discussions about my marriage, about my life. But those meetings quickly became about something more. Every touch, every glance, every word felt like a new layer of intimacy being peeled away. It wasn't just therapy anymore. It was us. Meanwhile, James started to notice. Of course he did. How could he not? I was coming home later and later, canceling plans, acting distant. I was physically present, but emotionally, I was somewhere else. When James tried to talk to me about it, I deflected, pretending nothing had changed. It's just work, I would tell him. I'm fine, really. But James wasn't convinced. He knew something was off. I could see it in his eyes, the suspicion growing. And then one night, when I walked in after yet another late meeting with Julian, he confronted me. Sarah, what's going on? You're different. I don't know what's happening, but you're pulling away from me. I tried to brush him off, but he wasn't having it. Is there someone else? Have you been seeing someone? Because this isn't normal, Sarah. The words hit me like a slap. How could I tell him the truth? How could I admit that I was emotionally involved with someone else, someone who wasn't even supposed to be part of my life like this? No, James, I lied, forcing the words out. I'm just going through a rough patch. Work is stressful. That's all. There's no one else. He didn't believe me, but what could he do? He had no evidence, nothing concrete. I couldn't confess. Not yet. As the days passed, Julian and I continued to meet, and our physical closeness grew. What started with a simple hug turned into something more. A hand on my thigh during a conversation, his breath on my neck as we talked late into the night. I told myself I was just escaping, that I was simply looking for comfort. But it wasn't just that. It was something deeper, something I couldn't explain, even to myself. I felt alive when I was with him, something I hadn't felt in years. With Julian, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't just another piece of furniture in someone else's life. I mattered. The affair began in small, unspoken moments. At first, there was guilt. But with each passing day, that guilt faded, replaced by a growing attraction, a growing need for the man who truly understood me. It wasn't just about the physical intimacy anymore. It was the connection, the bond, the way he made me feel like I mattered. I told myself it was special, that Julian was different from James, that he cared for me in a way James never had. Meanwhile, Megan was getting more and more suspicious. She could see it in my eyes, in my behavior, in the way I spoke about Julian. I couldn't hide it from her forever. Sarah, she said one afternoon, her voice cautious. I know you're seeing him a lot, but are you sure about this? Are you sure Julian is really helping you? I brushed it off, but her concern didn't go unnoticed. He's amazing, Meg. You don't understand. He's helping me. Really? He gets me. Megan didn't press me for answers, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She knew something wasn't right, but I wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. The affair was growing, and so was the web of lies I had to weave to keep it hidden. I was no longer the woman I had been. I was someone else entirely, someone who was losing herself in the arms of a man who was supposed to be helping her, but had become something far more dangerous. And yet, I couldn't stop. I didn't know how to anymore. The moment I found out James knew, it was like my entire world crumbled in a single second. I had been living in this bubble, convincing myself that I could keep everything under control, that no one would ever find out. But James wasn't as oblivious as I had hoped. He had known something was off for weeks, maybe longer. And when he couldn't get the answers he needed from me, he took matters into his own hands. I didn't realize at first, but James had hired a private investigator to follow me. When the investigator returned with the evidence, the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. The photos, the text messages, all of it was there, laid out in front of him. The affair with Julian, the meetings, the intimate moments I had so foolishly let slip. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the betrayal with someone who was supposed to be helping me, someone who had sworn to maintain professional boundaries. I had broken more than just our marriage. I had broken the trust of someone I thought would never do this. When James confronted me, I was caught completely off guard. He wasn't shouting. There was no rage in his voice, no loud accusations. He was cold, calculated, detached. It was worse that way, somehow, like he had already processed everything and was just laying out the facts for me. He placed the photos and text messages on the kitchen table between us, and all I could do was stare at them, my heart pounding in my chest. "Explain this," he said flatly. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but my words were jumbled. "It's not what it looks like, James," I stammered. "Julian is helping me emotionally. He's just a therapist. It's not like that. I was lost, He cut me off, his voice ice cold. "Lost? You didn't just lose yourself, Sarah. You betrayed me. You went to someone you trusted with our marriage and turned it into something else. You let him into our lives, into our most intimate space." The pain in his voice was raw, and yet I couldn't find a way to apologize that felt sincere enough. The guilt weighed heavily on me, but I couldn't admit to the full extent of my actions. I wasn't ready to face it. "This is over," he said, his words final. "I can't do this anymore. You've ruined everything." And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving me standing there in shock, unable to move, unable to breathe. The next few days were a blur. James didn't come home that night. He barely spoke to me after that, and I knew it was over. I had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. But even as I sank deeper into the pit of my own guilt, I knew I had to somehow repair things, make things right. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him for good. But James had a different plan. He didn't waste any time. Within days, he had started seeing someone else. Her name was Hannah Brooks, a receptionist at the same clinic where Julian worked. I couldn't believe it at first when I saw the photos, but there they were, plastered all over social media. James and Hannah, holding hands, laughing together. It was public. It was blatant. He was flaunting it, and he was doing it in a way that I couldn't ignore. Megan was the one who told me about it. She knew how much it hurt, but she couldn't help but express her disappointment in me, even though she still cared for me. "Sarah," she said, her voice gentle yet firm, "I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you let it get this far." I couldn't even respond. The photos of James and Hannah together were everywhere, and each new one felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. My humiliation was complete. I had betrayed him, and now he was exacting his revenge in the worst possible way. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him how much I regretted everything, how much I wished I could undo the past few months, but it was too late. He had moved on. He was happy with someone else, and I was left in the rubble of my own choices. Desperate for someone to talk to, I turned to Julian. I thought he would be my comfort, that he would help me make sense of everything. I thought he would be there, like he had been during those long sessions. But when I called him, he didn't pick up. I left messages, hoping he would come through. When he finally did return my call, he was distant, cold. "Sarah," he said, his voice lacking any warmth, "I don't think I can help you anymore. This was never supposed to go beyond therapy. Our relationship wasn't meant to become what it did." I was stunned. The man I had opened my heart to, the one I had let into my most vulnerable spaces, was now shutting me out. I begged him for support, told him I needed him more than ever, but he didn't care. He didn't want anything to do with me. And in that moment, I realized the ugly truth. Julian hadn't cared about me the way I had convinced myself he did. He had been a temporary fix, a distraction from my real issues, and now that I needed him most, he was gone. I was completely alone, with no one left to turn to. I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. The guilt, the regret, the self-loathing. I had destroyed my marriage, betrayed my husband, and now I was facing the consequences. My career, which had once been so promising, began to falter. I couldn't focus at work. My thoughts were consumed by the mess I had made of my life. In a last-ditch effort to pull myself together, I sought therapy with a different counselor, but it felt like a futile attempt. The pain of what I had done, of what I had lost, was too overwhelming. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun the wreckage of my own decisions. I had broken everything, and now there was no way to fix it. I never thought it would end like this. At one time, I imagined that if everything fell apart, I'd have a place to turn, someone to turn to. But here I am, utterly alone, and every attempt I've made to salvage anything has only pushed me further into isolation. I've lost everything: my marriage, my friends, even my own sense of self. The realization that I have no one left to rely on has hit me like a freight train. Desperate for some kind of comfort, I turned to the only people I thought might offer me refuge: my parents. I hadn't seen them much in recent months, especially with all the chaos in my marriage, but surely they'd understand. Maybe they could offer some advice, some comfort. I needed something to hold on to. But the moment I walked through their front door, I felt the weight of their disapproval before they even spoke a word. My mother, as cold as ever, didn't even ask how I was doing. She just looked at me with those piercing eyes, her disappointment clear. "You should fix things with James," she said. Her tone was flat, devoid of any compassion. "You've made a mess of your life, Sarah. He's a good man. You shouldn't have thrown it all away." I swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "It's beyond saving," I whispered, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "He's already moved on." My father, usually the softer of the two, said nothing for a long time. His eyes were full of sadness, but he didn't argue with her. Instead, he merely nodded, as if to say that the damage had already been done. They didn't understand. They didn't see the full picture. And no matter how much I tried to explain, it wouldn't change anything. My mother's impatience with me was palpable. I could feel myself growing smaller in her eyes, and I realized that my attempts to fix things with them were futile. I had already failed them. After that, I tried reaching out to Julian. He had been my lifeline in the darkest moments of my marriage, my escape, the person I'd turn to when everything fell apart. But when I called him this time, I felt the coldness in his response right away. His tone was distant, detached, nothing like the warmth I had grown used to. "Sarah," he said, almost curtly, "our sessions were never supposed to go beyond professional boundaries. I've made it clear that I can't be involved with you beyond that." His words were like a slap in the face. I had opened my heart to him, trusted him with my most vulnerable feelings, and now he was shutting me out. The harshness in his voice made me feel like I was disposable, like I had been nothing more than a brief distraction for him, a way for him to feel good about himself without any real emotional commitment. His indifference hurt more than I ever thought possible, and I could feel myself sinking deeper into the abyss of despair. Days turned into weeks, and I could feel myself spiraling. The weight of my decisions, the affair, the betrayal, the damage to my marriage, began to consume me. I stopped going out, stopped trying to fix anything. I stayed in my small apartment, where the darkness of my mind was my only company. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. I couldn't bring myself to care. My colleagues noticed the change in me, how distant I had become, but I didn't care. They didn't know. They didn't understand. I didn't even understand myself anymore. Then one day, the final blow came. The divorce papers arrived in the mail, crisp and formal, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil I was drowning in. They were signed, final. James had made his decision. He had moved on with Hannah, the woman he was now in a serious relationship with. The words on the page seemed to blur in front of me as I realized the enormity of what had happened. I had lost everything. My marriage, my love, my sense of purpose gone. The divorce was official, the ink still fresh. But the emotional devastation was irreversible. My stomach churned as I thought about how everything had turned out. I had thrown away a life that could have been. I had ruined it all for what? A temporary escape? A fleeting affair with Julian, who never even cared enough to be there when I needed him the most? As if to add salt to the wound, James and Hannah began posting their happiness all over social media. Pictures of them together, smiling, laughing, building a life that I had once dreamed of. They were engaged now, making plans for the future. And I was still trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces of a life I had shattered with my own two hands. The more I saw of their happiness, the more my world seemed to collapse in on itself. Megan tried to be supportive, but even she couldn't hide the disappointment in her eyes when she looked at me. I had been the one to make the decisions, the one who had broken everything, and now I had no one left to turn to. I was utterly alone, and I couldn't escape the suffocating guilt that weighed down on me. In one final attempt to gain some closure, I reached out to James. I asked him to meet me in the park, the place where we used to walk hand in hand. I needed to hear it from him. Why had he moved on so easily? Why had he given up on us? When we met, I could see the faint traces of softness in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to change anything. He looked at me, his expression a mix of sadness and resignation. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I tried. I fought for us for as long as I could, but I couldn't keep fighting for something that was already gone. Your affair, it destroyed everything. I don't trust you anymore, and I don't think I can ever forgive you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I couldn't respond. I had no defense. How could I? He was right. I had destroyed everything we had. He stood up to leave, and before walking away, he looked back at me one last time. "It's time for both of us to move on, Sarah. There's nothing left here." I watched him walk away, and the emptiness that followed was unbearable. There was nothing left for me in this life. No one to lean on, no reason to hope for anything better. I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I had destroyed. And now, as I sit here alone in my empty apartment, I realize that there is no way to rebuild it. There's no escaping the consequences of my choices. The life I had once imagined for myself is gone, and in its place, there's nothing but a hollow existence, day after day. I've lost everything, and there's no way to get it back. The months after the divorce felt like an eternity. Time seemed to drag on, and each day blended into the next with no distinction. I remained in the same apartment, staring out the window at the same view, wondering where everything had gone wrong. My life had been ripped apart, and I couldn't seem to pick up the pieces. I tried to reach out to old friends, but it was like talking to a wall. Megan, who had once been my closest ally, had pulled away. I don't blame her. She had watched my life crumble from the inside out, and I could see the judgment in her eyes. She couldn't bear to watch me self-destruct anymore, and who could blame her? I couldn't even bear to watch myself. I didn't know what to do with myself. The emptiness in my life was suffocating, and every attempt to fill it with distractions only left me more hollow. My work suffered more and more. I couldn't focus. I couldn't find the motivation to care about anything. The woman I once was, the woman who had dreams, aspirations, a future, felt like a distant memory, an illusion of someone I would never be again. In my darkest moments, I thought about Julian. He had been my confidant, the one I had turned to when everything in my life seemed beyond repair. I told myself that maybe if I could just make him see me again, just make him understand, he could somehow make it all better. I sent him countless messages, pleading with him to talk to me, to explain, to help me understand why everything had gone so wrong. But he never replied. Days passed, and I only became more desperate. Finally, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I tracked him down at his office. I had no appointment, no reason to believe he would see me, but I needed answers. I needed something, anything, to hold on to. When I walked in, he didn't even look up from his desk. "Dr. Cross, please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I need to talk to you. Please just give me a moment." He glanced up briefly, and then his gaze returned to the papers in front of him. "Sarah," he said, his tone cold, detached, "I think it's best you move on. Our relationship, if you can even call it that, was never real. I never intended to do anything more than help you with your marriage. It wasn't meant to be anything else." The words hit me like a physical blow. My heart sank, and a feeling of complete emptiness washed over me. All of those months, all the time I had spent clinging to him, believing that he cared in some way, it had all been a delusion. He wasn't there for me. He wasn't ever going to be there for me. "You need to move on, Sarah," he continued, his voice growing colder. "You're dragging me down with your emotional baggage. I can't help you anymore." The finality in his voice shattered me. He had never cared. He had never been the person I thought he was. And now, here I was, completely alone, abandoned by the one person who I thought would understand me the most. Julian had been my escape, my crutch, and now he was gone. And I was left to face the aftermath of everything. That night, I found myself alone in my apartment, sitting on the floor, unable to stop the tears from flowing. I was crushed. I had no one left. I thought about James, about how I had thrown everything away for a fleeting moment of comfort. I scrolled through old photos on my phone, pictures of us, pictures of the life we once shared. The memories felt like cruel reminders of everything I had destroyed. Each image, each memory, only deepened the guilt I felt. The woman I had been, the woman who had loved him, was gone. In her place was a hollow version of myself, consumed by regret and sorrow. The guilt became unbearable. I had ruined everything. I had lost the love of my life, the person who had trusted me, and I had done it all for nothing. The affair, the lies, the endless search for validation. It had all led me to this moment of complete and utter destruction. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't fix anything. And now, I was left with nothing but the consequences of my actions. It was in that moment, as I sat there on the floor, that the full weight of my situation hit me. I had been searching for validation from everyone but myself. I had let Julian become a symbol of something I thought I needed to fix my life. I had used him to avoid facing the reality of my own choices. And in doing so, I had lost myself, the affair, the search for someone to tell me everything would be okay. None of it mattered. The only thing that truly mattered was the truth. I had abandoned myself, and now I had nothing left. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't go back and fix what I had broken. I had destroyed my marriage, lost my friends, alienated my family, and pushed away the one person who had been there for me. My life, as I once knew it, was over. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to function, to move forward, but nothing felt real. I was a ghost in my own life, drifting through the motions, barely existing. I had no friends, no family, no future to look forward to. My work was a distant memory, my relationships non-existent. I walked through the streets alone, feeling the weight of my failure with every step. The world around me moved on, while I remained stuck in my own misery. One afternoon, I sat in a cafe, surrounded by happy couples, families, people who had what I could never have again. I watched them, wondering if they even realized how lucky they were, how easy it seemed for them to love and be loved. I realized, as I sat there, that I would never again experience the kind of love I once had with James. I had lost it. I had thrown it away, and there was no getting it back. And so, I continue to walk through life, day after day, with no real purpose, no real direction. My existence has become quiet, somber, and hollow. I have nothing left to fight for, and no one left to fight for me. The consequences of my actions will follow me forever, and there's nothing I can do to escape them. My life, once full of possibilities, has been reduced to this. A series of empty days, one after another, filled with the heavy weight of regret and the haunting realization that I destroyed everything that ever mattered.